Hello again, YouTubers, on with SpongeBob 101 back here again on the SpongeBob channel for a SpongeBob episode review. In this video, we are reviewing episode 273, Potato Puff, and There Will Be Grease. The synopsis states, Mrs. Puff's new substitute teacher gives SpongeBob a crash course in driving. Also, Mr. Krabs and Plankton must work together after discovering a well of miracle grease under their restaurants. Let's dive right in. The episode begins just like pretty much any other SpongeBob driving episode. Of course, SpongeBob is ruining everything. The most notable thing in the scene here is Mindy on the wall, and of course the fact that the baby actually grows up and literally carries the parents out of the house while SpongeBob continues destroying it. It's like a dynamite factory, which Mrs. Puff and SpongeBob narrowly miss, and they eventually crash land into Mrs. Puff's house, and Mrs. Puff is so frustrated. So while SpongeBob takes his leave with the portrait in the background there, showing exactly the exact doorway, Mrs. Puff calls up her guru. This guy's voice is probably the exact same as the guru from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Seriously sounded exactly the same. The suggestion to Mrs. Puff was that basically she should be able to teach SpongeBob without actually being there physically in a way. And so Mrs. Puff on her way to work notices a submarine. It's Frenchie's submarine, and he's peeling potatoes. I'm not sure why he is, but Mrs. Puff decides to, well, basically break into the submarine and steal a potato for the purposes of decorating the potato and conning SpongeBob basically into thinking that the potato is Mrs. Puff, just attaching that little walkie-talkie over there. It kind of reminds me about the very first episode of Driving in SpongeBob Boating School, right? Where SpongeBob was using the walkie-talkie in his head to listen to tips from Patrick, basically. That may or may not be a throwback, I don't know. So Mrs. Puff decides to chill in her lighthouse at the school. It seems like she has an entire facility in that lighthouse. We've never really seen that much in the lighthouse, aside from in Lighthouse Louie and maybe a couple other episodes. But anyways, yeah, basically she just sits back, relaxes, and watches wrestling. So yeah, Mrs. Puff is a really wild character, you know. I think goes actually a-okay until Mrs. Puff accidentally says left, and SpongeBob hears it on the walkie-talkie, and then he breaks onto the highway, and this is when the chaos ensues. There is a lot of explosions in this episode, by the way, and Mrs. Puff, for some reason, completely just forgets all about the fact that she's supposed to be instructing SpongeBob, who is now driving through a playground, breaking through the jail, and wrecking the city, basically. And SpongeBob decides to become a vigilante student driver. I don't even know why he put this on to chase after that kid who was breaking the traffic rules, because, like, student drivers don't actually have any authority to do any of what he was trying to do. One of the guys that went off the bridge earlier meets his friends at this place called the Knobby Knuckles Saloon. They spot SpongeBob and Potato Puff, and they chase after them. We then flash over to the Dynamite Factory again, where Rube Goldfish makes another cameo here. He's being a tour guide for the parents and that little baby from the beginning of the episode. They are in big trouble because we have those bikers and the kid driving into the Dynamite Factory. So we have really crazy stuff, and the baby's just like, oh, not again. There is a whole explosion in the background. SpongeBob decides to, you know what? Just put on some sunglasses and keep on driving. Man, that is some cool stuff, but also ridiculous. So yeah, the wrestling show pretty much ends, and now breaking news comes on the TV. Madman on a rampage, and we all know who that madman is. SpongeBob SquarePants. So Mrs. Puff is, well, shaken off her chair. She looks outside the window. Bikini Bottom is up in flames, and she becomes, well, a wrestler. I find this side of Mrs. Puff not particularly cool. She cannons herself into Bikini Bottom and manages to catch up with SpongeBob, and after a whole bunch of explosions and collisions, Mrs. Puff, or at least Potato Puff, becomes mashed potatoes. And SpongeBob, thinking that Mrs. Puff is now mashed potatoes, is crying there until he just gets comforted. And yeah, basically that's the episode, right? So we have the whole bunch of saloon dudes really pissed off, but then they realize that Mrs. Puff is tough, the Puff or something, and so they calm down. But then the police comes by, and you know what happens? Mrs. Puff goes to jail, right? Just goes back to normal, or Mrs. Puff ends up in jail. Seriously, like, all the driving episodes are pretty much like this, and actually that's the reason why I'm gonna give the plot a 5 out of 10. There were some great references, but the plot itself is just the same thing, just now with a added wrestling and burning city theme. It's like smashing Wormy and Krusty Crushers into one, along with like boating school. The surprising thing is, if Mrs. Puff had been in that seat, then probably all of this wouldn't have turned out the way it did, but you know, probably something else would have happened instead. Animation wise, I think this episode deserves a 8 out of 10. I really liked a lot of the references and a lot of the explosions too, sometimes quite funny. And finally, unique characteristics. I will give this a 6 out of 10. Of course, we did see a little bit a different side of Mrs. Puff, which, whether I like it or not, is good. Overall, I think it's a below average episode, aggregating the score 6.3 out of 10. The episode ends up with Mrs. Puff being stuck with her potato doppelganger. Yeah, that was Potato Puff. Not a fan. Moving on to There Will Be Grease. This is actually my preferred segment out of the two. It begins at a Krusty Krab, where SpongeBob is busy cleaning the Krusty Krab, and Mr. Krabs tracks some grease into the restaurant, which makes SpongeBob want to wash it down with water from the hose. And meanwhile, Plankton is doing some science experiments on the opposite end of the road with Karen. You know, it's a beautiful day to do science outside until a bubble from SpongeBob causes the entire concoction to explode in Plankton's face. So yeah, typical Plankton stuff. And when questioned what he's actually doing, SpongeBob says that he's cleaning up the spill over there, and Plankton realizes that it's not just any like spill. Then Mr. Krabs decides to fight with Plankton over it because he wants to profit over it, and claiming that it was on his land. Karen does a test on the goop that is on the ground and realizes that it is actually grease. And they realize that the concoction is basically a combination of the grease from Plankton's chum and Krabby Patty. This concoction has been leaking into the ground, and there's now basically a giant aquifer underneath the Krusty Krab and chum bucket of that stuff, right? So this brings us to the partnership. Whenever there's willing cooperation with Mr. Krabs and Plankton is when I actually am really interested in an episode. Plankton suggests selling it to the military, and there was actually a cameo of the Plankton robot from the second movie again, and then even creating bombs smells like french fries to lure the enemies in. Mr. Krabs, of course, is more money-minded in the sense of supporting his own business, right? So he decides to put it on Krabby Patties, turn it into grease milkshakes, and even using it as air freshener for the toilet. It's pretty hilarious, but Plankton burns that thought off the screen, and eventually they start fighting again, only for SpongeBob to come along, trying to fish out some of the grease and put it in his bucket, saying that actually he uses it for everything. You don't have to use it for one thing. He says that he uses it as toothpaste, shower gel, deodorant, even shoe polish, and even, of course, his breakfast for Gary and his own. Yeah, this gives Mr. Krabs and Plankton the idea to monetize this liquid, basically this Dr. Crafton's Miracle Everything Juice. First of all, that is a really awesome idea. You gotta give praise to the person who came up with that name. They caused a huge traffic pileup, and now with some captive prospective customers, they start selling their Dr. Crafton's Miracle Everything Juice. And it turns out pretty good, you know, everybody's pretty happy about it, and they are flooded with a stash of cash. So now it's time for some marketing. So yeah, the first marketing target here is Mrs. Puff, and actually it was really funny. Like, I mean, aside from fueling the boats and stuff, it has like cleaning properties. It can moisturize your face and remove wrinkles, that kind of thing. Their second target is Sandy, and Sandy doesn't really buy it initially, like the fact that using it can grow grass. I mean, that's a pretty tall order for grease to be able to like be used to grow grass. But of course, polishing the glass, and yeah, you know, it's pretty funny watching them trying to be salesmen, and it kind of works out for a while until their finale of the sales pitch is a musical. This is my favorite part of the episode, and I think many of you will agree with me. Basically, they put on a song. You guys have absolutely got to go check it out. But anyways, Dr. Crafton's Miracle Everything Juice musical. And, you know, things actually work out well. You have Lady Upturn here offering to buy everything. And this begins a scramble for buying all of the Miracle Juice, right? The Everything juice. And so Plankton, Mr. Krabs, they are very, very successful. And so eventually they even get their own office building called Dr. Crafton's. You can even see the jellyfish holding the miracle everything juice. And Mr. Krabs and Plankton are basking in mountains of cash. And they realize that, isn't what they were doing basically partnership, cooperation, and friendship of all things? And yeah, they actually get along for a bit, but this is when everything starts going downhill, unfortunately, because everybody in Bikini Bottom is here to riot. Yes, they are here to demand refunds because the juice does not actually do everything. I mean, who could have thought, right? So yeah, Sadie is a particularly outraged customer, of course, as she always is. Mr. Krabs and Plankton realize that their time is up, and so they just decide to leave the building. Why didn't Mr. Krabs just try to grab as much cash as possible instead of just leaving it to the rioters? Yeah, anyways, they return to the Chum Bucket and the Krusty Krab, and they go back to their respective restaurants, once again, not friends, but bitter enemies. And this is when, because all the drilling had emptied out the cavity under the Chum Bucket and the Krusty Krab, this causes both the Chum Bucket and the Krusty Krab to crash right into that new cavity. And guess what? They are buried together. What? I will have to give this episode a 9 out of 10. A really genius idea. Honestly, my alternate plot would have basically been them succeeding and then actually closing down the Krusty Krab and the Chum Bucket because they realize how successful this Dr. Crafton's business is. And, I would have preferred if SpongeBob was the proponent to say, hey, no, you shouldn't close down the Krusty Krab just because of this. And then suddenly, the typical resource curse thing, the thing dries up. And then everything goes back to normal. Animation. I will also give this a 9 out of 10, especially for the musical. Genius, absolutely genius. And unique characteristics, again, musical, even the marketing portions. It's really fun to see Mr. Krabs and Plankton working together and not just fighting each other all the time. And this is also for a very unique purpose. Overall, There Will Be Grease gets a 9 out of 10 from me. Alrighty, so that is all for this review. Comment box below what you thought about these two segments, and make sure to subscribe, like, favorite, comments, etc. Keep right here on SpongeBob 101, and I'll see you guys in the next SpongeBob video. Bye!